the idea of society feeding off of the least of these and growing strong from marginalized groups. But we'll get to that here in a little bit. Sam asked me to come in and speak about my book. I wrote a book on the topic of theology and the traditional vampire narrative in popular culture. It's called Such a Dark Thing. Unfortunately, it's my own copy, but if you want to buy it after this, it's on Amazon. I'm not going to stop it. But how I figured we'd do this today.
I have a loaner copy by the way.
Oh wow! There you go. Cool. How I figured we'd do this is I'll just kind of mix it up a little bit. I'd do maybe a few readings here and there, discuss some of the theological concepts that are within the book. Some of you may be familiar with, some of you might not be familiar with, I don't know. But then, questions at any point are fine. If you have a question while I'm talking, raise your hand, or if you want to wait until a section is done, you can ask your question then. I'm not going to feel insulted if you raise your hand in the middle of something. So I figured what I would do was just give you a little background on how this came about, and then read the preface to the book, because that's sort of like an intro to everything that you're going to hear. I was in grad school with Sam, and was working on an independent study. The study started off as looking at the horror genre within entertainment, particularly movies, but literature as well. I'm a horror fan. But looking at how horror is and religion are closely related. It sounds weird to say if you're not familiar with the topic, but religion is seeped in. I mean, if you look through the scriptures, you basically can read at different times very horrific stories. The plagues, for one. In the story of the plagues, God is referred to as the destroyer, which is kind of a horrific term. The flood, the amount of death and destruction involved in the flood, we treat it as a Sunday school, cute little Sunday school story that has a rainbow at the end, but it's also a story of mass genocide. The story of a teenage girl being impregnated by an unseen cosmic deity. If you're familiar with any of the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, that's pretty much what he deals with, is this idea of the cosmic breaking into our world. And when you talk about it like in the terms of Christianity, we talk about it in a positive way. The cosmic breaks into this world and all, but Lovecraft says it's a horrific thing when the cosmic and the unknowable breaks into this world, because we cannot comprehend it. So religion and horror are very closely related. But what has seemed to have happened over the generations is that in order to have worship services and to make our religion more palatable to individuals who'd like to worship, the teeth of religion, what I call it, the fangs of religion, have sort of been set aside. And the horrific aspects have been downplayed. Like I said, the flood story has become a cute little Sunday school story. So we've sort of dulled the fangs. But those horror elements had to go somewhere, and some of us would argue that that's how our horror genre has emerged in literature, and cinema, and television, is because those horrific elements had to go somewhere. So they sort of came up in that respect. But anyways, I was working on an independent study on this, and it proved to be too big for an independent study, so I decided to shave it down to one particular subset of the horror genre, and that was vampire narratives within popular culture, whether it be literature, cinema, television, etc. So I did this independent study, and the professor who was supervising the independent study was writing a book for Whiffenstock, which is an academic publisher. And he said, hey, I think they might be interested in this. You might want to, and I'm like, really? I mean, me? He's like, no, send it in. So I sent it in, and they contacted me a few months later and said, if you can expand on this, we'd love to, we'd love to publish it and everything. So that was how it ended up being created. So what I'm going to do right now is just read you the preface from the book. One of my goals with the book was to make it, I didn't want it to be overly academic. I wanted it to be accessible to the lay reader, but also I wanted it to also be a challenging read in the sense of academia and theology as well. I wanted to discuss theological concepts that aren't often discussed, Theodicy for one. Theodicy is how do you explain evil under the umbrella of a God of good? That's theodicy. Or is God part of evil? Is God separate from evil, or is evil part of God as well? So these are some concepts that I wanted to discuss in the book. So let me read you the preface, and then we'll go from there. The preface is entitled, "It's in the Blood." And the epigraph is from The Lost Boys. A quote from Grandpa, if you've ever seen that movie. "One thing about living in Santa Carla I never could stomach. All the dang vampires." I censored myself there. "In 1979, I was 8 years old, held aspirations of a career as a Jedi Knight, and lived, as every 8-year-old should, oblivious to the fact that childhood was a limited arrangement. It was on my 8th birthday, as a matter of fact, when I settled in with my family to watch the highly anticipated CBS miniseries Salem's Lot. Little did I know the effect the movie would have on my life, dropping me down a swirling rabbit hole of lifelong nerddom. It wasn't as if I were treading on some sort of virgin ground of horrific gods and monsters. I watched Marty Sullivan's Superhost every Saturday on WAB 43, remember? A local Cleveland television station where I received my dose of Godzilla flicks, regular replays of the terribly underrated television movie Gargoyles, Hammer horror films, and the expected parade of universal monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, et al. I was a well-seasoned veteran of the creature feature, thanks in large part to the waning days of Forrest J. Ackerman's publication, Famous Monsters of Filmland, as well as being the beneficiary of parents who saw nothing wrong with taking their kids to movies such as Jaws 2 and the Amityville Horror. Salem's Lot seemed to me to be a different beast entirely. The commercials alone were terrifying, the story was based on a best-selling novel by Stephen King, and television wasn't anywhere near the horror genre playground then that it is today. This was an entertainment event, one my parents were gracious enough to let me participate in, even knowing that I would end up irretrievably spooked and sleeping in their bed for the foreseeable future. Despite this, I persevered through both nights of the frightening miniseries. My world irrevocably changed. How intensely my heart pounded when young Rafi Glick emerged from the dense fog outside of his brother's window. The deathly scrape of dirty fingernails on glass, those dead yet piercing eyes, that malevolently hungry smile. The visceral clutch of terror that gripped me when newly turned vampire Danny visited a sleeping Mark Petrie, commanding him, with equal parts conspiratorial whisper and animalistic hiss, to open the window. The living nightmare I suffered through when Mike Ryerson returned for schoolteacher Jason Burke, patiently sitting on a rocking chair in the guest room of the old man's home. These pale visages haunted my dreamscapes for countless nights, hovering above my bed as I slept, ravenous smiles leering at me from the impenetrable blackness of my closet, the door of which always seemed to be slightly ajar no matter how many times I closed it. One might assume that exposure to the ghastly netherworld of horror at such a young age would have driven me to the lighter side of childish pursuits. Nevertheless, I found myself inexplicably drawn to the unsettling fear I experienced as I gazed out the window of my bedroom at night, wondering in all of that darkness if some malignant thing was staring right back at me. After surviving the miniseries, I petitioned, pleaded with, and cajoled my parents into purchasing for me the novel Salem's Lot. While only 8 years old at the time, I was already a voracious reader, tearing through endless Hardy Boy novels. There was no YA back when I was a kid. You had to find what you could find to read. So Hardy Boy novels, comic books, and whatever else passed for young adult literature during the waning years of the 1970s. My parents soon relented, and on a cold Christmas Eve in 1979, as my family traversed central Ohio, visiting various relatives with a car full of wrapped presents, I commenced reading what would undoubtedly become my favorite novel of all time, and in my estimation, one of the most important American novels of the 20th century. This is an important preface to the rest of Such a Dark Thing, Theology of the Vampire Narrative in Popular Culture. While I am an academic, I am first and foremost a dyed-in-the-wool, card-carrying, was watching Doctor Who in the 70s before it was trendy nerd. Before hipsters paraded around in socially acceptable zombie walks, I pored over issues of Fangoria, Gorezone, and Starlog in high school study hall, devoured the films of George Romero, Sam Raimi, Don Coscarelli, and was purchasing prosthetics and finger extensions through mail-order catalogs so I could dress up like Count Orlok from the 1922 silent film masterpiece Nosferatu. My childhood and adolescence were, for better or for worse, reflective of the boys in the film The Monster Squad in 1987, a movie that served as a manifesto of everything I loved about life and pop culture. Oh, and did I mention I was somewhat of a social pariah as a result? I am a fanboy. I love horror and take the genre seriously, as evidenced by the zombie tattoos covering my arm and the Library of Congress catalog number for the novel Salem's Lot on my lower leg. Yeah, I told you I liked the book. And I eventually discovered that my academic interests in religion, mythology, and social justice movements dovetailed nicely with a brand of storytelling that, at its best, not only touched on all three, it also boasted frightening and spectacular monsters. From the social commentary of George Romero's zombie films, to the unintentional Judeo-Christian morality play of the Friday the 13th franchise, to the plethora of science versus God themes perfectly embodied in James Whale's Frankenstein, and its endless progeny, such as the excellent 2009 film Splice, the horror genre is rife with narrative complexity. I took this arguably overzealous love of horror into my early career as a student pastor. I regularly introduced clips from genre movies, encouraging students to view film and the horror genre as an allegorical tool. More often than not, I had to explain to angry parents why I was showing movie clips of Christopher Lee's Dracula being defeated with two candle holders in the shapes of a cross by Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. You know, it's about redemption, sin. So, dear reader, I make this pledge to you. I will do my best to avoid the dry, joyless academic blather that can often accompany a book of this nature. Sure, there is the requisite technical mumbo-jumbo that goes along with any research project. However, my hope is that you will have fun reading such a dark thing. After all, we're discussing vampires, and if discussion of vampires should be anything, it should be fun, not an annoying and horrendously dull slog of pretentious self-involvement. I'm looking at you, Twilight. You know, Twilight digging. So that's the introduction to my book, which will serve as an introduction to our discussion today. So far, are there any questions about anything? I am from Central Ohio, so you know the Superhost references and whatnot. I grew up outside of Ashland, outside of actually a little town called Polk, Ohio. So I was very isolated. Was not a farm kid, but I went to went to school with a bunch of farm kids. So that's my background. So what I want to discuss now is the early. The baseline, the basics of what we need to discuss when discussing vampires or horror and theology. This is from a discussion I've given in the past. There's elements of this in the book as well, but this is basically a message I've given to other groups around this at some academic conferences and whatnot. So if anyone has any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand. So whether used as a direct allegory or a whisper of a metaphor, the traditional vampire narrative deals with issues of the soul, the hope for a life hereafter, and the potential of forces beyond our control to deface that hope. In other words, the very presence of the vampire in a narrative, whether overtly religious in the mold of Count Dracula, or seemingly, and the thing is about the novel Count Dracula, it's filled with Christian symbolism. I mean, the cross and holy water and sacred spaces. But beyond that, Dracula actually references scripture at different points in the novel. Van Helsing himself refers to himself as a Christian warrior. And some would argue, not that Bram Stoker ever discussed this directly, but some would argue that Stoker wrote the novel Dracula as a form of Christian proselytization. He was a Catholic. He was very devout. But even without the religious background of vampires, you can have an entirely secular vampire as modeled, like, say, the vampires portrayed in the movie 30 Days of Night. But its very existence speaks to a theological or religious nature. Whether a refusal to commune with or before the divine, or even an inability to accept spiritual oblivion, the presence of the vampire is to hold company with a theological uncertainty. I gotta move this, sorry about that. I'm gonna move that there. At the climax of the previously mentioned novel Salem's Lot by Stephen King, Ben Mears, the author turned reluctant vampire killer. How many people have read the book or seen the miniseries? Okay, a few. Okay.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Quick background. Guy who spent some time growing up in a small town goes back to visit that small town because he wants to write a book on the haunted house that sort of overlooks that town. It sits on a big hill. It's called the Marston House, and it sort of overlooks that hill. Well, when he shows up, bad things start happening in the town. Kids start disappearing. Turns out a vampire has moved in, and then it becomes almost very similar to the story of Dracula, where fearless vampire hunters come together. They decide that they have to figure out a way to stop the vampire. That's sort of a quick, broad, there's much more to it, but that's sort of the understanding of the book. But he's come face to face with the vampire master, Barlow. Also, how much of a fan I am. I have 2 chihuahuas who are named after the villains in Salem's Lot. As the sun sets and the showdown begins, Barlow, the vampire, psychically and violently invades the mind of Mears. And this is what he says, quote, "Look and see me, puny man. Look upon Barlow, who has passed the centuries as you have passed hours before a fireplace with a book. Look and see the great creature of the night, whom you would slay with your miserable little stick. Look upon me, scribbler. I have written in human lives, and blood has been my ink. Look upon me and despair," unquote. Now, faced with the overwhelming power of his otherworldly adversary, Mears is sapped of his strength. He becomes weak, and he's suddenly all too aware of his own finite mortality. He's faced with this supernatural creature and grows weak because of it. This devastating response to the presence of the vampire illustrates what German theologian Rudolf Otto described as the mysterium tremendum. And that is a radically other mystery that brings on a stupefying combination of fascination and terror, wonder and dread, holding these two things in tension at the same time. And these are traits, Otto argued, of religious experience present in the sublime as well as the horrific. The awareness of the mysterium tremendum occurs in response to what we call the numinous, another term coined by Otto that describes encounters with the divine, as well as a feeling that remains where the concept fails. Sometimes we put love into this category. It's a feeling that we have, but we can never really fully describe the concept. What is love? It's a feeling we have, but can you tell me what love is really? Chemical, psychological, spiritual, what is love? And so Otto says that's numinous. And our encounters, when we have what we feel are encounters with the divine, that is numinous. So the stock and trade of the vampire narrative, horror as a whole, but the vampire narrative in particular, relies on the awe and mystification brought on by the dread of the mysterium tremendum, experienced in the wake of the supremacy of the numinous figure. So whether in the guise of Ben Mears in Salem's Lot, Jonathan Harker from Bram Stoker's Dracula, or if you've seen the movie Charlie Brewster from Fright Night, any of the heroes who have seen fit to directly challenge the supernatural force of the vampire have been brought emotionally and spiritually low by the numinous presence of the undead. And you know, some would argue, well, that's drama. You need that in a story. You need the hero to be weak, and so the hero can rise up against the stronger adversary. And that's true. That's absolutely true. But it also speaks to, in the context of that narrative, of a horror narrative, of the vampire narrative, they are often brought low by their fear. Not necessarily because they're outmatched, but because of how strong their fear and awe is of the presence before them. And we see that all throughout Scripture, when people are faced with angels, when people are faced with the presence of God in some way, they are brought low by that presence. They're not dancing around and happy. It says they fall to their knees, they cry out, they're fearful. So that's the numinous presence. And this achieves a distinct and horrible awareness of the hero's utter lack of ability to effectively act against the monster. So not only is the vampire an ambiguity or mysterium to those who encounter the creature, But the creature possesses the ability to strike fear and trepidation, or tremendum, in the best of humanity, emerging from the page and screen as an undoubtedly numinous figure. Interestingly, the concept of mysterium tremendum put forth by Otto was meant to convey the effects of a distinctly religious encounter, a brush with the divine. Therefore, our analysis of the vampire through the lens of mysterium tremendum raises two very important questions. Now let me stop here before I raise these questions. I don't believe vampires exist. I don't think they're real. You would be surprised how many times I've said, do you think they're real?
Do you wish they were real?
Yeah, time might make things more interesting. I don't know.
I don't believe it, but I wish.
You got to be in the house by sundown. It makes life more interesting. And you'd be surprised how many times I've been approached by people who are like, so are you making a vampire religion? What are you doing here? I believe in the power of narratives. I believe in the power of what narratives can teach us about ourselves and the world. And so viewing that through the lens of the vampire narrative is what I'm doing here. So I just wanted to, toss that out there in case someone's like, dude, vampires don't exist. All right. So here's the two questions. One, if the vampire in the narrative displays traits of the numinous, must we consider it a symbol of the divine? Much in ways we have various symbols of the divine throughout Scripture and other narratives outside Scripture. A burning bush is a symbol of the divine. So it's not just the presence of God that is our direct representation of the divine in narratives. We see symbols that represent that all the time. So should we consider the vampire a symbol of the divine since it carries the power of the numinous? Within myth history, the vampire has conquered death, promises everlasting life, and even displays power of some aspects of the created order, such as weather and nocturnal creatures. So that sounds very divine. And the second question is the divine, for which the term mysterium tremendum was coined, horrific in nature? This is a big question that people don't want to talk about. Is the divine, whether you're referring to the Christian God, whether you're referring to the Judaic God, whether you're referring to Allah, is God, by God's very nature, horrific, based on its power to destroy, power to change the created order? Is that horrific? The stories we see of God interacting in the Hebrew Bible with humanity, are these horrific stories or are these uplifting stories? When I read the Hebrew Bible, when I study the Hebrew Bible, I see lots of horror. I see lots of scary things. I see lots of bloodshed. I see lots of times where God breaks into the created order and shakes things up in a way that is not necessarily beneficial to humanity. From our perspective, the flood. The flood was not beneficial to humanity. The flood, if you take that story at face value, is a story about God saying, all right, I'm going to clean up my mess.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what that story is.
Redo.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to start over here. That's horrific to think about, that this capricious, powerful creature can wipe out so much life because it just wasn't crazy about what was going on. Now, and also don't get me wrong here, I am not anti-religion. I am not anti-scripture. I just look at this stuff, I want to analyze it and talk about it, because I think despite how horrific some of these things can be, we have a lot to learn from them that can enhance our spiritual walk and our spiritual life. So as I mentioned before, H.P. Lovecraft, he believed that the contemporary horror genre emerged in its present form as a sort of doppelganger to modern religion. It's sort of a malevolent compartment that the devout often keep at arm's length, while using it to compile their unspoken and unrealized fears about the shadow side of the divine. Lovecraft himself wrote in his novella, The Call of Cthulhu, he wrote, quote, "The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The science, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age, unquote. So, what Lovecraft is saying is the unspeakable reality of the divine that takes sort of an amorphous shape in his mythos that he writes about, which is modeled in the Call of Cthulhu, may in some ways reflect the equally indescribable, horrific elements of God that have been knowingly obfuscated and shifted to the outright and therefore easily dismissed genre of the monstrous. So what I'm saying here is that how often do we discuss the horrific of religion, or the horrors of religion? Not too often, because one of the reasons that we don't is we don't want to venture out into this unknown area, this scary area, because we'll end up fleeing from it. There's a reason why pastors on Sunday mornings don't necessarily get into the death of millions of people at the hands of a God who does a flood. Because that's not very uplifting, and the further we venture out into that, the further we know we may flee from that. So the pages of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are rife with the horrific, including cosmogonic chaos, mass murder, worldwide disaster, demons, war, witchcraft, cannibalism, and the divinely promoted exploits of the devil. And when I throw witchcraft into that, I'm talking witchcraft as it's portrayed within Scripture, not necessarily our current modern understanding of Wicca and witchcraft. So this diabolic aspect of Scripture, however, has either had its fangs dulled through the need for palatable and civilized religious services, or altogether ignored entirely by contemporary faith communities. Unless you're Westboro, they love the scary crap. They throw it out there left and right. They got no problem, but of course, you know, they are also ineffectual too. We give them far more credit than they deserve. Through the traditional vampire narrative found in literature and cinema, however, the monstrous has found an avenue to convey the power of its own religious experience. The horrific divine found in the Mysterium Tremendum. Now, yes?
I don't know how to ask this precisely, but it seems like things are very dualistic in this model. Like there's the bad guys and there's the good guys. And the good guys are sometimes bad and the bad guys are sometimes good. And it's not sort of a yin-yang kind of thing, or is my perception of this being kind of dualistic over
at step one?
simplifying?
Yes. As far as an introduction, yes, it's discussed very much in a Manichaean good versus evil aspect. If you buy the book, what you begin seeing as it progresses, we begin breaking out of that model.
Okay.
And if I don't know if I'm going to have time or not, but I discuss how these narratives can then break us down into looking at how interreligious cooperation is important. We begin looking at the vampire potentially as not the symbol of oppression, but the symbol of freedom, breaking people free from their mundane life. They are free of their worries. I mean, I critique that too, but the thing about narratives is any kind of narrative that you get into. Like someone will go see a movie or someone will read a book and they say, "Oh, what the auteur mean by this? What the author mean by this? What the director mean by this?" And I'm a believer that once a piece of artwork is out of the artist's hands, it's up to us to decide how we individually want to view that work. So one of the things I try to do in the book is show a multiplicity of views that the vampire narrative can take. So, because what happens is, like, there's a book called, I think I may touch on it, it's called The Vampire Defanged. And it's written by a professor who, what's the Jerry Falwell School? Liberty? Is that right? Yeah, Liberty. A professor at Liberty, a theology professor at Liberty. And it's actually a pretty decent book. But she says Dracula and its ilk are Christian parables, and they're written as a way to show how spiritual warfare works, and it's good versus evil, and there's nothing else. And the book is just very laser focused on that. And I will agree that it can be viewed through that lens. But I would also argue that it can be viewed through a number of other lenses as well. Because one of the problems you get into, if you want to, I'm just going to jump ahead of here a little bit. If you want to get into the idea that the story of Dracula written by Bram Stoker, or even the movie Dracula, which differs tremendously from the book, is a strictly Christian parable, then you have to ask yourself some very serious questions. For example, they kill Dracula with violence. What does that say when your faith fails? Because they try faithful ways to stop Dracula. They try symbols, they hold up the cross, and that repels Dracula for a period of time, but it doesn't kill Dracula. They try holy water. That repels Dracula for a period of time, but it doesn't kill Dracula. So then what do they have to resort to?
Stake it out.
Well, in the original Dracula story, it's a knife to the back. That kills Dracula, and then the sun rises and kills him. But then that has evolved into a stake through the sternum. So, what religious elements today resort to violence when their arguments don't work, when their faith doesn't work? We're talking ISIS. We're talking extreme American Christian conservatism that likes to use violence when... So it's like, what are we arguing here with Dracula? If you want to use it as a literal Christian parable, then you're saying that when your faith doesn't work the way you want it to work, you have to resort to violence. Yes.
I probably haven't read the book as much as you have, Salem's Lot, but I do recall when the priest, Father Callahan, went after Barlow with, because he was the warrior for God. It was the fact that he lacked his own faith in his own religion,
right,
and had no power before Barlow.
Right. The argument can be made that he placed his faith not in his Catholic faith. He placed his faith in the symbol of his Catholic faith, the cross. And the French writer Baudrillard writes about this, and he talks about the phases of the symbol, and how the symbol, ultimately, as a symbol exists, and then you have symbols of the symbol, okay, we have the cross, and then people wear it, and I'm speaking from a Christian theology standpoint here. We have the cross in the church, but then people walk around with crosses on their body, and then crosses get put on t-shirts for marketing purposes, and blah, blah, blah. Baudrillard argues that each phase that symbol goes through, like it's memorexed each time. Is that what it used to be called, memorexing, when you would copy things over? Xeroxing, thank you. You're Xeroxing it every time, and every time you Xerox something, it loses a bit of its quality. It loses a bit of its clarity. And so Baudrillard says that ultimately what you end up with is simply a symbol that has no connection to the power or force or ideology that symbol represented in the first place.
I think the argument, if I remember correctly, in Salem's Lot was that the symbol, the actual physical symbol itself has no meaning at all.
Correct.
It's the faith behind the symbol, and
Correct.
if that is not strong, then the symbol,
Yes.
doesn't mean a thing.
There's a passage in Salem's Lot where a king writes, and it's during the finale, and the two remaining heroes stop at the church and get holy water, because they've discovered in the book that holy water glows blue when they are near a vampire or near danger. It's sort of like their spidey sense that they can use. And so it's like they're at the showdown, and one of them pours holy water over himself, and he's like glowing blue, and he's got an axe, and he's trying to break through a door to get to the main vampire. And this whole passage that King writes about, because the other person is watching him do this, and he talks about how it's a power like an orb from the center of the earth that has necessarily no connection to any type of organized religion. It's a universal power that has found its way through this particular avenue at this particular time to show its power. So that's another way of saying, well, if they had a Torah instead, that it was their faith and their desire for justice and their desire for right that sort of was the avenue for this power to work through them. Because in that scene with Father Callahan, he doubts himself internally in his inner monologue. He doubts his own strength. He doubts his own internal power. And a traditional Christian would say, well, they shouldn't rely on that. They should rely on the power of God. But King is making an argument within his book that that's not what we should do. That there is, when we feel there is a need for justice, when we feel that there is a need for good, that we can rely on ourselves and our community to act on that, and we can find power through that. And once we do that, then the universe's power will work through us as a unit. At least that's how I interpret. Again, that's how I'm choosing to interpret Salem's Lot. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yes, and I was feeling depressed as an atheist that I didn't have a God, and vampires and this whole thing left me in the cold. But then the last part you said made me feel a little bit less out of the sphere.
And one of the things that and it's toward the end of the book, or at least toward the book is broken up into two halves. The first half is sort of the academic-y type stuff. And the second half is I discuss a lot of movies and films and books. Basically, I give you my favorites, and I discuss why they're my favorites and how they connect to what we just discussed in the first half of the book. But at the end of the first half of the book, I discuss an ethicist, a woman. Her name is Sharon Welch, and she wrote a book called The Feminist Ethic of Risk. And in that book, and I sort of build on what she talks about viewing God as the adverb, and not a noun or verb, but God as the adverb. And so giving people a way to sort of have faith without having faith, which I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's a way to view God as sort of like, because what traditionally in most faith communities, how it works is that you have God at the top. God gives God's orders and precepts, usually through scripture of some kind, and those trickle down, and then the faith communities build their faith communities based on these precepts, laws, orders, etc. By viewing God as the adverb, what happens is community goes to the top. And community decides what its needs are, where it needs to fight for justice, what it needs within its own particular community. And those becomes the precept, and those become changing and bendable, where God's precepts do not change. God's precepts are rock solid, and they're not allowed to change. But with the community at the top, those precepts are going to change because community's needs they change. And so those precepts trickle down, and then our view of God is created out of those precepts and needs and desires.
That perfectly describes our church. I mean, that's a lot of how we envision ourselves, although maybe that sounds prideful, but that's...
No, and I think that's one of the things I argue with people who say you're anti-religion, because I am not anti-religion. I spent 3 years, I'm going to go spend a few more years studying religion, so if I was anti-religion, I'm the biggest idiot in the world because I'm spending a lot of time around it. I'm not anti-religion. My argument with religion is that orthodoxy is the danger. Saying that this is how it is, this is how it needs to stay, this is how it was, that's the danger. That's when we start, when we become unbending, we hurt people because they act in ways that we don't necessarily agree with because of a religious faith. I feel that religion needs to be, and UU is an excellent example of this, it needs to become a mosaic versus a painting. The painting is solid and unchanging, a mosaic changes. A mosaic can be added to, a mosaic you can subtract from as you progress. And so that's my, and it doesn't need to be, Christianity can do this as well. Christianity doesn't need to lose its idea of what makes Christianity Christianity in order to be more of a mosaic. It just needs to understand that there's more views and more narratives. There's more things under the sun than we can possibly, so that's what Christianity needs to, in my opinion, in order to continue to grow and be a cultural voice. I think the Methodist denomination right now is a perfect example. The Methodist denomination is the last mainline denomination to not ordain people in the LGBTQ spectrum. There are people in the LGBTQ spectrum who are ordained, but they have to stay quiet about it. Now that's recently changed because a bunch of them signed a letter coming out to the higher-ups, the bishops, and everything like that. And that's still to be seen what's going to happen with them. But the Methodist argument is that unchanging, this is how it's always been. So we're not going to change it anymore, or change it at all. And I predict the Methodist denomination to either split eventually, as it should in this case, or lose membership. And they are. I mean, we're seeing that now with their numbers. Their numbers are dropping, and just public approval of. I mean, it's like Presbyterians have done it, Episcopalians have done it, Lutherans have done it. It's like you're the last ones, and you look so prehistoric like this. So yeah, my argument is that religion as a whole, Christianity, Muslims, Jewish people of Jewish faith, it needs to become more of a mosaic and less of a stringent rule of how things need to operate within their denominations and within their faith. So I'm very much pro-religion. All right, what am I looking at? Are we already there? We're already there. Oh my gosh! All right, so wow. Okay, so anyways, well that'll get you started. Are there any questions? Any other questions? Yes.
It's not really a question, but maybe more of an opinion.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the horrific part, and what always struck me as horrific was you have free will, and God is a loving God, but yet He knows what's going to happen at the very end. So even though you have free will, you're still going to burn in a lake of fire if you don't do what you're supposed to do, even though He already knows what you're going to do. So He's damning you to hell.
Well, I'll take you one step further than that. I mean, and we do need to preface that by saying that that's not a universal Christian belief necessarily. There are progressive Christian denominations that don't necessarily believe in the concept of hell. Because it's not scriptural. But if you are someone who believes that you think that it's that weeping and gnashing of teeth, that one line is hell, then I'll take you one step further with the horror, and that's a being that says that it loves you.
Right.
Is going to send you to an eternal lake of fire with suffering and weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I always hear the argument, well, as a parent, you discipline your kids, right? And it's like, I don't make them suffer for eternity, I'm not sending them down with Pinhead and the Cenobites or anything like that, but...
grounding a kid for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
This is a way whole thing than burning forever.
I also
all the
think
time.
when I watched The Passion of Christ,
Yeah.
there was Mary, how horrible would that have been? Even though He came back and everything was, great, how could you watch your child, again, a loving God, His Father, just, that was very hard for me to watch.
Well, and the presence, I'll make this quick, the presence of suffering across the board with most major religions, that's sort of universal, the presence of suffering. These scriptures came from environments and cultures that suffered greatly. In all sorts, not that they knew they were dying early, but they were dying young, because that medical treatment and the food and a lot of our kosher laws came from food infecting people and killing them.
Yeah.
Wars, children dying in childbirth. Most of these tribes woke up every day. It's not all that different from how things are in the Middle East still. These tribes can wake up and be invaded any day. So suffering was a way of life for the people who were writing these books and these scriptures. So of course suffering is going to seep itself, and the horrors of their life are going to seep their way into these writings. That doesn't mean we bring them into the 21st century. That means that we understand them for how they were written, by who wrote them, and for what purpose they were written. Because ultimately they wanted to show suffering, and then usually, like the story of Job. The story of Job is about suffering. You talk about a horror story in Scripture. It's about suffering, 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 but then they want to show at the end, you can get through the suffering And if you have faith in God, it's going to be okay. Sure, you lost your wife and all your kids and all your crops, but you get some new ones at the end. It's like the price is right. You know, you got through it, now here's your big prize, you know. But that's where those stories, that's where those things came from, was a world of suffering. We don't live in, necessarily anymore live in that world of suffering.
That's where that bending and that mosaic.
Right, exactly.
But when I was very young, I went to church and I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
I'm going straight to hell. And I was just a kid.
Yep.
So that's kind of when I lost my faith in the first place.
I'm sorry I couldn't get through more, but I hope you
You'll
found
have to come back.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you found it interesting enough to look into it further, but thanks everybody.
Now that was a cheery note. Remarkably cheery, actually, for them. So,